you very much, Madam President. It is exam term. I hate to mention it in front of everybody. So let's start with a test. Put your hand up if you think you can confidently name all of your members of the European Parliament and the UK's EU Commissioner. One person. I won't put you on the spot. But what a sign. A room such as this, in one of the UK's great universities, politically engaged people who've chosen to give up a night in the library revising to come to a debate on this great issue of our day, and there's one person in the room who thinks they could name their MEPs. To put you out of your misery, you have three here in the northeast of England. They're Paul Brannan, Judith Curtin-Darling and Jonathan Arnott, two Labour, one UKIP. And the EU Commissioner representing the United Kingdom is Commissioner the Lord Hill of Orford. So you'll know for the next pub quiz. But it's a sign. I couldn't name all of my MEPs. I think in London I've got one who's a member of the Green Party called Jean Lambert, or at least I used to. I've got friends who work in Brussels who tell me the French delegation there thought it was another French MEP called Jean Lambert. This is sort of the problem with the EU, the lack of accountability, the lack of democracy, the lack of permeability. I thought I'd just cover some of the points that we heard from the first two speakers on the opposition. Mr Hazel started off reading his notes rather excitingly on an iPad, so I can't accuse him of being stuck in the past like so many proponents of the 1950s institution, which is the European Union. It was very forward-thinking. Presumably that one of these fantastic contraptions that he sported at the dispatch box comes from one of those newfangled companies like Apple that we hear so much about and that we'll finally be able to take advantage of if only we can get the EU to sign a free trade deal with America so we can seize those opportunities in the future. Mr Hazel said he was happy to embrace the label of federalism for his side of the House, and I'm glad to hear it. It's a helpful admission for our case. He said that's because power is where the money is. The trouble is in the EU, and certainly in the EU of the coming decades, which money do you mean? There's one currency, the euro, the single currency, which many people on that side of the House have spent so long arguing that the UK ought to join. And then there are those non-Eurozone countries who've seen the failure of that largely political project and decided to stay outside it. The EU is diverging, we're going down two tracks, so the power is diverging accordingly. The Eurozone countries already have an automatic voting majority in the European Council. That means the UK, if we stay in, is going to be further marginalised in an EU that is going off in separate directions. We're also one of the biggest net contributors to the European Union. So if power is where the money is, and we're one of the largest contributors, well, where is our influence? We've been outvoted 72 times. Every time we've objected to an EU law in the European Council and pushed it to a vote, we've lost. And those laws have been applied to the United Kingdom against our will, against the best efforts of the people that we have democratically elected and sent to battle in Europe on our behalf, at great cost to our businesses. And then there was a very pessimistic chapter of Mr Hazel's speech, where he said that today we are not at that great power that once we were. Today we govern less than 1% of the world's population. Contrast that with the optimism of the two speeches which have preceded me on this side of the House. We are the world's fifth largest economy. We speak the language that 1/3 of the world's population does. We have four of the world's best four of the world's top 10 universities in the UK. And I'm afraid that doesn't count Durham just yet. Win your audience over. The pessimism also of talking about our ancestors who walked over here from Europe and restricting our future ambitions to just 27 other member states that happen to be close to us in an age where distance has never mattered less, where you can trade with IT specialists in Bangalore, where you can trade with a startup in somebody's house on the west coast of the US or in Canada. A bizarre section, I'm afraid I've rather lost the point, about Protestants and Catholics who were limping out of concentration camps in 1945 and finally accommodating peace between these two factions of Christianity. That's something that the United Kingdom managed to do centuries before with the Civil War, the Reformation and everything else.
Point of order. It was happening in Northern Ireland until 1997.
I will gladly come on to Northern Ireland because
well, that is the United Kingdom.
Yes, it is, and I will come on to it because we heard a lot of scaremongering in the second speech from the opposition. Lord Haskins started his speech with his job application to work as an advisor to Boris Johnson in 10 Downing Street. I'm not sure he would get it on the basis of that job application. He firstly inflated the size of the... he says good.
No, he said he thought he would.
He started off by inflating the size of the UK's rebate. He's obviously a much greater admirer of Mrs Thatcher and her handbagging than I put him down for. But the rebate that Mrs Thatcher did so much to fight for, which is our money in the first place, and she asked that we could have it back so we could spend it as the British government, as elected by the British people, chooses, is itself subject to negotiation with the European Union. And then we had a whole series of scaremongering, including points about Northern Ireland, starting off with farmers. Now, the Common Agricultural Policy is not only inefficient, it not only wraps up small British farmers in huge amounts of red tape that are so frustrating to family farms, it is extremely unfair to some of the world's poorest people. The Common Agricultural Policy is designed to best advantage French farmers. It disadvantages, for instance, producers of cocoa, who can sell the raw ingredients but can't turn into the sorts of companies that can compete by making these into chocolate bars and chocolate products that can compete with the European Union and the tariff barriers it erects. He talked about universities, forgetting the point that this is our money in the first place. We send £350 million to the EU every week. We get less than half of it back, and we have no say in how it's spent. If we leave, we will have all of that money. We can match all of these EU subsidies, penny for penny, and still be quids in. Then we got to the point about the border with Ireland. It was not the European Union which secured the peace process in Northern Ireland. In fact, we owe more to Americans like Bill Clinton and General de Chastelain than we do to the EU. It is pretty disgraceful in this referendum for the Remain side to be bringing the Northern Ireland peace process into the debate like this. The Good Friday Agreement was agreed by referendums on both sides of the border after 1998. There has been peace and stability in Northern Ireland since then. It has absolutely nothing to do with this referendum, and I hope we'll hear no more of it.
Sorry, could you explain why the Irish government is so concerned about the situation? Very concerned about the situation, about the economic side of it and the political side of it. And what goes on, I agree with you, Europe had very little to do with the settlement itself, but Europe had played a big part in the development of your Northern Ireland economy in the last 20 years. And I'm sure Northern Ireland is going to vote yes. I might be wrong, I'm sure.
We'll find out in June how they vote. I sincerely hope that, like the rest of the United Kingdom, the people of Northern Ireland will vote to leave. The government of the Irish Republic wants us to stay in the European Union, that's for certain. The Republic of Ireland has done particularly well out of the EU in some years, receiving lots of subsidies, lots of money. But you've seen the explosion of the Irish economy, and then the price that they've paid since then for that sort of the short-term investment and the failure to stand on their own 2 feet and run their economy in the best way for themselves. But the point about the border is a complete red herring. There's been a common travel area between Ireland and the UK since the 1920s. Even at the height of the Troubles in the 1970s, there wasn't, there was a porous border between the UK and the Republic of Ireland. We live in a much more peaceful time. We live in a time when the UK and Ireland will, of course, want to continue to trade together and live peacefully together. We heard some really extraordinary things about the Falklands War. Apparently it was the European Union that has safeguarded the sovereignty of the people of the Falklands. I mean, you're all too young to remember the Falklands War. I was born after it as well. I can't remember the EU task force that was sent there across the South Atlantic to keep the people of the Falklands free.
What I said was the Falklands are in favour of Britain staying in Europe. That's all I said. And Gibraltar in favour of staying in Europe. I didn't say they did anyway winning the war.
But I think the greatest defender of the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands or the people of Gibraltar is an independent United Kingdom. The government of Spain, successive governments of Spain, have claimed Gibraltar for their own for 300 years. They will continue to do so, whatever the outcome of our referendum in June. and it is only a strong UK government that will be able to keep them safe. We heard from both speakers a bit about environmental protection, as though it's only the EU that has been able to do anything about protecting our environment. Well, remember, the United Kingdom passed a Clean Air Act as early as 1956, before we joined the European Union. Things like these are a global challenge. They're not restricted to just 28 member states. In fact, it's much more important that we can get some of the big polluters like China around the table. And we can do that working together, not just as the European Union, but working with the United States, working on a truly global scale. The EU's voice here is so diminished that at the Copenhagen Climate Summit, a summit that the EU helped to fund, in some of the key discussions, the EU wasn't even represented in the room. It's not the European Union that will protect the environment of the entire world. I'd just like to end by underlining the difference in the two sets of speakers that I hope you've heard tonight. On their side, pessimism, that we are not a great global power any longer, we can only achieve things if we continue to pay these millions of pounds a week to be part of a club that tells us how to run our country, that passes the majority of laws that affect all of us and all the businesses that keep our economy going. And contrast that with the advantages that we have as the United Kingdom. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. We are one of the largest military powers. We have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, home to 4 of the world's top 10 universities, as I say, and the most widely spoken language. And we gave birth to the common law system that so many people around the world use. What more assets do we need? What more advantages do we have to convince ourselves that we can continue to thrive as an independent nation and to vote leave on the 23rd of June? I hope that you will do that tonight and do that again when the referendum comes. Thank you.